The stranger in the photograph. Sarah found the photograph by accident. She had been cleaning out the attic of their new home, an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, when she stumbled upon a battered shoebox tucked away in a forgotten corner. The dust was thick, coating the lid in a soft, undisturbed layer, as though no one had touched it in decades. Inside, there were old letters, yellowed newspaper clippings, and at the very bottom, a stack of black and white photographs tied together with twine. She untied the bundle and flipped through them absent-mindedly, smiling at the faded images of unknown faces frozen in time. But then she saw it, a photograph of her husband, Mark. Her breath caught in her throat. It was unmistakably him, his dark hair, his sharp jawline, the slight dimple in his chin. He stood in the center of the picture, surrounded by a group of people dressed in old-fashioned clothes. The picture looked decades old at least, yet Mark appeared exactly as he did now. Sarah frowned, studying the people standing beside him. Their faces were blurred, distorted in an unnatural way, as though something had gone wrong in the development process. Their bodies seemed wrong too, twisted at odd angles, limbs too long, heads tilted unnaturally. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She hurried downstairs, the photograph clutched in her hand. "Mark?" she called, her voice unsteady. He was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. When he looked up, his face lit up with a smile. "Hey, babe, what's up?" Sarah hesitated. She suddenly felt foolish, but the unease in her stomach wouldn't let her drop it. "I found this in the attic," she said, holding out the photo. Mark took it, glancing at it casually. And then, something strange happened. For the briefest moment, his expression went blank. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the photo. Then he smiled again, too quickly, too forced. "That's weird," he said, laughing uneasily. "I've never seen this before." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "You sure?" she asked, watching him closely. "Yeah, of course. It must be someone who looks like me. You know, people always say I have one of those faces." He set the photo down on the counter, a little too carefully. "Where did you find this?" "In a shoebox in the attic," she said slowly. "Huh. Well, old houses have old things, I guess," he said, chuckling. "Nothing creepy about that." But there was something creepy about it. And Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was lying. The second photograph. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay beside Mark in bed, staring at the ceiling, the photograph still burned into her mind. It didn't make sense. The clothes, the aging of the picture, it had to be at least 70 years old. But Mark looked the same. She decided to go back to the attic. The air was heavy with dust as she stepped inside, flashlight in hand. She retrieved the shoebox and rifled through it again, hoping to find some sort of explanation. And then, beneath a bundle of letters, she found another photograph. Her breath hitched. It was Mark again. This time, he was standing in front of a house, a different house, but still an old one, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The picture looked even older than the first, the edges brittle, the ink faded. And yet there he was, the same man, the same face, the same expression. Sarah's hands shook as she searched frantically through the rest of the box. More photos, more versions of Mark. In some, he wore old military uniforms. In others, he stood beside horse-drawn carriages or outside theaters advertising silent films. And in every single one, the people surrounding him were distorted. She stumbled back, knocking over a stack of boxes. The sound was deafening in the silence of the attic. Mark stirred downstairs, calling up to her, but she didn't respond. Her heart pounded wildly as a terrifying thought took root in her mind. Who, or what, was her husband? Confrontation. The next morning, Sarah placed the photographs on the kitchen table in front of Mark. He stared at them in silence, his face unreadable. Then he sighed. "Sarah, this is ridiculous," he said, rubbing his temples. "It's just a coincidence. Maybe a relative who looked like me?" "You don't have relatives," she whispered. Mark's eyes flickered, just for a second, but she saw it. "Of course I do," he said, but the words felt hollow. Sarah stood abruptly. "Tell me the truth." Mark met her gaze, his expression darkening. "Sarah, tell me!" she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. And then something shifted in his face. The warmth drained away, replaced with something cold, something ancient. "You don't want to know the truth," he said quietly. But Sarah did. The truth that night. Sarah locked the bedroom door and stayed awake, waiting. She didn't trust Mark anymore. She needed answers. At 3 a.m. she heard movement. The rustling of clothes, the soft creak of floorboards. She crept out of bed and peeked through the keyhole. Mark stood in the hallway motionless. But he wasn't alone. The figures from the photographs were with him. Their faces were still blurred, their bodies twisted and wrong. They surrounded him, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. And Mark, her husband, was speaking to them in a language she didn't recognize. Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Mark turned his head slightly, as if he had heard her. And then the figures moved, melting into the shadows, disappearing into nothing. Mark stood there for a moment longer before slowly walking back toward the bedroom. Sarah scrambled back into bed, pretending to sleep. The mattress dipped as Mark lay down beside her. She kept her breathing steady, forcing herself to remain still. But in the darkness, she felt him watching her, and then he whispered, "You should have left it alone." The escape. Sarah didn't wait for morning. As soon as she was sure Mark was asleep, she grabbed the photographs and fled the house. She drove to the nearest motel, locked herself inside, and spread the pictures out across the bed. She needed proof. She needed someone to believe her. She pulled out her phone to call the police. But then her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mark. "Come home, Sarah, you don't understand. You never will." She dropped the phone, her blood running cold. A knock came at the motel door. She held her breath. Another knock. "Sarah," Mark's voice called softly. "Come on, open up. Let's talk." She backed away. The knocks grew louder. The walls trembled. And then, from the window, she saw them. The figures. The strangers from the photographs. Standing in the parking lot, staring up at her room. Their faces were no longer blurred. And they looked just like her. The last text message. It was a night like any other, or so Evelyn thought. The rain tapped against the window pane in rhythmic succession, a steady drumming beat that mirrored the erratic pace of her heart. She sat curled up on the couch, a cup of lukewarm tea resting between her hands, its steam long since faded. Outside, the city was cloaked in darkness, the streetlights casting eerie pools of light on the glistening pavement. She had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the silence that filled the apartment since that dreadful night 1 year ago. A year had passed, yet the grief lingered like an uninvited specter, creeping into every crevice of her mind. It had been a full 12 months since Olivia, her best friend, her confidant, had died in that terrible accident. A freak car crash, the authorities had called it. No rhyme, no reason, just a cruel twist of fate. Evelyn sighed, rubbing her temples, exhaustion threatening to pull her under. The weight of memories pressed upon her, suffocating and heavy. It was then, just as her eyelids fluttered shut, that the sharp ping of her phone jolted her awake. She frowned. It was late. Who would be texting her at this hour? Lifting the device from the coffee table, she glanced at the screen. The message was simple. A single line of text that sent a bolt of ice through her veins. "I'm outside. Let me in." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The sender's name displayed at the top of the screen, stark and undeniable. Olivia. Her fingers trembled as she read and reread the message, her rational mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a prank, some cruel joke played by a hacker who had gained access to Olivia's old number. But who would do such a thing? And why now? Dread slithered up her spine. Heart hammering, she hesitated before rising from the couch. Every step toward the window felt like walking through quicksand, her limbs heavy with fear. She parted the curtains, peering outside, and what she saw made her blood run cold. There, standing in the rain, was Olivia. She was smiling. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across her pale face, and her eyes, those familiar blue eyes, were gone. In their place were two bottomless voids, black and endless. Evelyn staggered back, her pulse a wild, frantic thing. This wasn't possible. Olivia was dead. She had seen the casket lowered into the ground, had stood beside her grave and wept until she could cry no more. And yet here she was, standing outside in the downpour, looking up at her with that grotesque smile. Another message appeared on the screen. "Why won't you let me in? Don't you miss me?" Terror constricted Evelyn's throat. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do, what to say. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to ignore the messages, to hide under the covers like a child fearing the monsters under the bed. But she couldn't look away. Her phone vibrated again. "I can see you." A strangled gasp escaped her lips. A surge of nausea twisted in her stomach. Her hands clenched into fists, knuckles white as she forced herself to take deep, steadying breaths. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the apartment. Evelyn's entire body stiffened. Knock, knock, knock. The sound reverberated through the walls, a patient but insistent summons. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. The air in the room had grown unbearably thick, each breath heavy in her lungs. Her heart pounded a frenzied rhythm against her ribs. She reached the door, hand hovering over the handle. The knocking ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, a whisper, low, distorted, and chillingly familiar. "Evelyn, open the door. It's me. Olivia, don't you trust me?" She let out a shuddering breath. "This isn't real, but it is. I never left you. I never will." The words slithered into her ears, wrapping around her like a vice. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes. This wasn't Olivia. It couldn't be. The handle rattled. Hard. Evelyn stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her phone buzzed in her grip, another message appearing on the screen. "If you won't open the door, I'll find another way in." A sudden crash came from the living room window. The lamp flickered wildly before plunging the apartment into darkness. A frigid gust of wind swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Then the whispers began. They filled every corner, layered upon one another, soft, pleading, mocking. Olivia's voice was among them, but it was twisted, distorted into something no longer human. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears. This isn't real. This isn't real. But when she opened them again, Olivia was inside. The dinner guest. James and Evelyn Carter had always prided themselves on their quiet, unassuming life. Their suburban home was tucked away on a street where no one asked too many questions, and that suited them just fine. So, when the Reinhardts moved in next door, the Carters thought it polite to extend an invitation for dinner. The Reinhardts, Charles and Lillian, were the picture of charm. Charles was impeccably dressed, his suit pressed to perfection, while Lillian exuded a strange, timeless beauty. Their smiles were warm, but there was something unnerving in their eyes. Something that made Evelyn feel as though they were looking straight through her. The evening began with pleasantries, idle conversation about the neighborhood, and glasses of rich red wine. The Reinhardts were well-traveled, had lived in many places, and yet, curiously, they never spoke about where they had lived before. As the night progressed, their questions turned oddly personal. "Tell me, Evelyn, do you ever think about that summer in college?" Lillian asked, swirling her wine glass lazily. Evelyn nearly choked on her drink. It was an innocent enough question, but there was something in Lillian's tone, something that suggested she knew the answer already. James, too, was subjected to the same unsettling inquiries. "That business deal a few years back, James, the one that didn't go quite as planned, must have been difficult for you. Do you regret the choices you made?" Charles's voice was smooth, but his gaze was piercing. The Carters exchanged nervous glances. There was no way the Reinhardts could know these things. These were secrets buried deep, confessions whispered only in the dead of night. And yet their guests recounted details as though they had been there, watching. The air in the dining room grew heavy, suffocating. The candlelight flickered, casting strange shadows along the walls. A chill crept into the room despite the warmth of the fireplace. Evelyn forced a smile. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Lillian leaned forward, resting her chin delicately on her hands. "Oh, but you do." James cleared his throat. "I think perhaps we should call it a night. It's getting late." The Reinhardts did not move. "We haven't had dessert yet," Charles said smoothly, his smile widening in a way that sent a shiver down James's spine. Evelyn stood. "I'm afraid we're out of time. Perhaps another night." Lillian let out a soft, knowing chuckle. "Oh, Evelyn, James, you still don't understand, do you? We're not here for dinner." The clock on the wall struck midnight. The wind outside howled like a wounded animal. The shadows in the room stretched impossibly long, swallowing the corners of the space. And then the Reinhardts' faces began to change. Their eyes darkened, their smiles widened unnaturally, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. Their skin grew pallid, almost translucent. The air grew colder still, filled with the sound of distant whispers, voices from the past, echoes of regret and guilt. James and Evelyn tried to move, but their bodies felt leaden, rooted in place as if unseen hands held them firm. "You invited us in," Charles whispered, his voice now an eerie distortion. "And now we collect what is owed." Evelyn tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. The walls of the house seemed to breathe, pulsing with something alive, something ancient. The shadows closed in, and then silence. The next morning, the Carters' house stood empty. The dining table was still set, the plates untouched. Neighbors would speak in hushed tones about how the Reinhardts had moved in, and shortly after, the Carters had vanished without a trace. Months later, another couple moved into the vacant house. Another invitation was extended, and the cycle began anew. The night I met my doppelganger. They tried to replace me. I remember the exact moment I saw him. It was a cold autumn night, the kind where the air feels thick with something unsaid, something unseen. I had left work late, the last one in the office, as usual. My apartment was a 20-minute walk from the building, and I always preferred the solitude of the night stroll over the stifling atmosphere of the subway. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional flicker of movement in darkened alleyways. I was about halfway home when I first noticed him. At first, he was just another pedestrian in the distance, walking toward me on the dimly lit sidewalk. His posture seemed oddly familiar, his gait almost identical to mine. As he drew closer, the streetlight above illuminated his features, and my breath hitched in my throat. He was me. Not just someone who looked like me. No, that would have been strange but acceptable. This was different. This man was an exact replica, down to the faint scar on my left cheek, the slight crook of my nose, the way my dark hair fell over my forehead. Even his expression, one of slight exhaustion mixed with detached curiosity, mirrored mine perfectly. I stopped. So did he. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a bizarre coincidence, a long-lost twin, some elaborate prank, but deep down, I knew none of those explanations made sense. He smiled. The same crooked smile I had seen in the mirror every day of my life. "Hello, Daniel," he said. I staggered back a step. He knew my name. Of course he did. Who are you?" I demanded. He tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "I think you know." I felt sick. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. This is some kind of joke, right? Some elaborate trick? He took a step forward. Instinctively, I took one back. "It's not a trick," he said. "I've been watching you for a long time, Daniel. And now, it's time. Time for what? For me to take your place." Something inside me snapped. This was insane. I wasn't going to stand here and let some lunatic play mind games with me. I turned on my heel and ran. But as I sprinted, I heard footsteps matching mine perfectly, as if my own shadow had come to life. I dared a glance over my shoulder. He was keeping pace with me, effortlessly, a calm, almost lazy expression on his face. "You can't run from me," he called. I veered left, cutting through an alleyway, leaping over a pile of trash bags. My breath came in ragged gasps as I emerged onto another street. I ran straight to my apartment building, fumbled with my keys and slammed the door shut behind me, locking every bolt. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Then, from the darkness of my apartment, a voice spoke. "You really thought that would work?" I turned so fast I nearly tripped. He was standing in my living room, the dim glow of the city lights casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. "What? How?" My voice was barely a whisper. He took a step forward. "You left the door open when you ran. I was already inside." The air in the room seemed to constrict. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something metallic. My keys. I hadn't dropped them. I was certain of it. And yet, there they were, dangling from his fingers. "You don't belong here," I said, my voice shaking. "You're not real," he chuckled. "But I am. I'm more real than you, actually." Before I could react, he lunged at me. I fought back, grappling with him, but it was like fighting my own reflection. "Every move I made," he countered perfectly. We crashed into the coffee table, sending glass shattering across the floor. My head hit the edge of the couch, and for a brief moment, the world went black. When I came to, I was looking up at myself. Only it wasn't me. He was standing there, adjusting his shirt, straightening his posture. He reached down and grabbed my phone from the floor, tapping in my passcode effortlessly. "You should have seen this coming, Daniel," he said, not even sparing me a glance. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like it wasn't entirely mine anymore. He walked to the door, whistling an all-too-familiar tune. "Wait," I croaked. He turned, a look of mild amusement on his face. "Yes? Why?" He smiled. "Because there's only room for one of us, and I've been waiting a long time to be real." Then he stepped out, locking the door behind him. I tried to stand, but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. I crawled toward the mirror near the entrance, my breath ragged. And when I looked at my reflection, there was nothing there, just an empty room. And then, from the hallway outside, I heard my own voice laughing. The next morning, no one recognized me. Not my coworkers, not my friends. When I tried to tell them who I was, They looked at me like I was insane. I went to my apartment, my home. He was there, living my life, wearing my clothes. The silent patient. When Dr. Claire Donovan first met Evelyn, she thought it would be just another routine session, a new patient with a troubled past seeking guidance. But there was something unsettling about Evelyn from the start. She had the kind of stillness that could fill a room, an unnerving quietness that seemed to stretch beyond her refusal to speak. The woman was not mute, she was simply silent. Claire had encountered patients who struggled to articulate their thoughts, those who found it difficult to open up. But Evelyn's silence was different. It was as though the very act of speaking was too much to bear. Her wide eyes, dark and vacant, spoke volumes, but she never said a word. It was as if something deep inside her prevented her from giving voice to the thoughts that churned beneath her calm exterior. At first, Claire thought it was some form of trauma-induced mutism. She encouraged Evelyn to express herself through writing, but even then, the woman only scribbled fragmented sentences, a stream of broken thoughts that made little sense. There were no clear memories, no recollection of specific events, only a sense of something lurking just beyond the surface, something both ominous and heavy. In the beginning, Claire's frustration with the lack of communication was palpable. She tried everything, from simple prompts to open-ended questions. But Evelyn would only sit there, staring at her, eyes unreadable, until the session ended with no progress. It wasn't unusual for therapy to take time, especially with patients who resisted talking. But Claire had a gut feeling that Evelyn's silence was hiding something much darker than she realized. The first strange occurrence happened a few days after Evelyn's second session. Claire had returned to her home, a small, cozy townhouse she had purchased after her divorce, and was preparing for an evening alone. As she settled into her living room with a book, she heard a faint whisper. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but there was something familiar about it. Claire froze, straining her ears. The whisper seemed to come from the kitchen, but when she got up to check, no one was there. She dismissed it as the house settling. Old pipes, creaking wood. It had been a long day, and her mind was likely playing tricks on her. But as the days went on, the whispers returned, always just out of reach, like a half-remembered song that wouldn't quite fade. They became more frequent, always in the background, just beyond her conscious hearing. Claire tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew stronger. It was as if the house itself had become a living thing, murmuring under its breath. She couldn't pinpoint the exact words, but there were feelings embedded in the sounds, hints of fear, of something dangerous. The first time she saw the shadow, she nearly screamed. It was late one night after a long session with Evelyn that Claire entered her hallway and saw something move in the corner of her vision. It was a fleeting glimpse, just a shadow passing by. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The sensation lingered, though, a cold, oppressive feeling, like the air had thickened. She tried to push it aside, convincing herself it was just the result of stress. But that night, she slept fitfully, waking repeatedly as a sense of dread washed over her. When the shadows returned, Claire was no longer willing to ignore them. It had been 2 weeks since Evelyn's last visit, and Claire's patience was wearing thin. The whispers in her home were no longer the distant murmurs they had been. They were right there, in her ears, clearer and more insistent. It was as though they were beckoning her, pulling her deeper into something she could barely understand. One evening, after a particularly frustrating session with Evelyn, Claire found herself alone in her office, staring at the patient's file. The silence had become unbearable. Her mind replayed the fragmented sentences Evelyn had written during their sessions, each one more cryptic than the last. She watches. The dark one. It follows. It waits behind the walls. Can you hear it? The silence is a cage. Claire's skin prickled as she read the last line over and over again. The silence wasn't just a symptom. It was part of the problem. Evelyn was trapped in it, and Claire was beginning to realize that her patient's silence was a form of communication. A communication that was growing increasingly more desperate and dangerous. That night, as Claire lay in bed, her mind racing, the whispers came again. But this time they were clearer, louder. She is the key. You must listen. Claire shot upright, heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. These were real voices, voices that weren't her own. They were coming from the very walls of her home, from the shadows that seemed to stretch out before her. The sense of unease had escalated to pure terror, and she knew deep down that this was no ordinary haunting. There was something tied to Evelyn, something sinister that followed the therapist back from the office, whispering through the dark. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could Evelyn be somehow causing these events? Could the silent woman, who sat so still and quiet during each session, have a connection to whatever was happening in her house? Had the therapy been a catalyst, bringing something to the surface, something evil that had been dormant for years? The next session with Evelyn was the turning point. As Claire sat across from her patient, she felt the tension in the room thickening. The air felt charged, alive with an energy she couldn't understand. She was about to speak when she noticed something. Evelyn's eyes, dark and intense, were fixed on her with an eerie precision. The whispers were louder now, filling Claire's ears. But when she tried to focus on them, they vanished, as if they were never there to begin with. Claire could no longer tell where the whispers ended and her own thoughts began. Her gaze flicked toward Evelyn, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of the woman's silence. Then, without warning, Evelyn's fingers twitched just once, but it was enough to make Claire's breath catch in her throat. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but in that moment, Claire knew. Evelyn wasn't silent at all. She was communicating, just not in the way Claire had expected. Evelyn's eyes never left Claire's, and in that stillness, the room seemed to shrink. Claire's skin crawled as she realized the truth. Evelyn wasn't mute. She had been speaking all along, through the shadows, through the whispers, through the cold air that surrounded them. Claire reached for the notepad on her desk, ready to ask Evelyn what she was trying to say. But before she could write a single word, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever before. This time they were all around her, inescapable. It is you, Claire. You have brought us here. She is waiting. Claire's mind reeled as the whispers coiled around her, filling her head, drowning her in a cacophony of voices. She looked at Evelyn, but the woman's face was no longer just still. Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. And then, as the room seemed to close in around her, Claire understood. Evelyn wasn't the patient. She wasn't the one in need of therapy. The therapist had been the one who was being studied, being watched all along. And now, it was Claire's turn to be silenced. The whispering walls. Lena and David had always dreamed of finding a home, a place where they could finally put down roots and build a future together. After years of saving, searching, and a fair share of compromises, they finally found it, the perfect house. Nestled on the outskirts of town, the old mansion had an aura of timeless beauty. It wasn't just the grand, sweeping staircase or the intricately designed windows that drew them in. It was something intangible, a feeling that the house was meant for them. They moved in without hesitation, eager to start their new chapter. The first few days were nothing short of blissful. The air was crisp, the surroundings quiet, and the house, despite its age, felt like it was alive in a welcoming way. The wooden floors creaked underfoot. The walls seemed to hum with a gentle vibrancy, and everything about the house spoke of comfort and sanctuary. But as the days stretched into weeks, something shifted. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. The stillness of the house was never truly silent. At night, when the moonlight bathed the rooms in a pale glow, Lena could hear it. The faintest whispers, like someone softly speaking just beyond the walls. At first, she assumed it was just the house settling. Old homes had their quirks, after all. But as the days went by, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Lena. It was her name, soft, hushed, as though it was being carried by the wind. She paused in the middle of the kitchen, her hands frozen over the sink, her heart racing. It was as if someone was standing just behind her, speaking directly into her ear. But when she turned, there was nothing there. She glanced around the room, and though everything seemed perfectly normal, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She told herself it was nothing. Perhaps the wind, the house shifting, or just her mind playing tricks. But the whispers continued, never quite loud enough to fully hear, yet unmistakable. Sometimes they felt like they were coming from the walls themselves. Sometimes they spoke of things Lena had never told anyone. Secrets she had long buried, things she had never shared with David or anyone else. One evening, as she sat on the couch reading a book, the whispers took a darker turn. This time they were louder, more frantic. She could hear David's name now, being murmured in the same low tone. David, David, you can't hide from the truth. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She stood, moving slowly toward the wall that seemed to hum with the voices. She could almost feel the vibrations under her fingertips, a faint pulse, like the heartbeat of the house itself. But when David came home that night, she couldn't bring herself to tell him. How could she? How could she explain something as irrational as the house itself speaking their names, revealing their secrets? That night, as they lay in bed, she finally broke the silence. David, have you ever heard it? He turned to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Heard what? The whispers, she said, her voice trembling. From the walls. It's like the house knows things about us. Things we've never told anyone. David chuckled, but it was a nervous, almost forced laugh. Lena, this house is old. It's settling. You're just tired. It's probably nothing. But Lena wasn't so sure. She hadn't imagined the voices. They were real, undeniable. And the more she listened, the more they seemed to know about her and David. Things that only the two of them could know. Dark secrets that no one else had ever learned. The next night, the whispers grew louder, sharper. She could almost make out the words now. You're hiding. You've never told him the truth about Sam. Lena's blood ran cold. Sam, her older brother. Gone without a trace years ago, his disappearance still an open wound for her, a question that had never been answered. The police had never been able to find him, and Lena had never spoken of him again. Not to David, not to anyone, but the walls knew, the house knew. It wasn't just her anymore. David's name began to echo through the walls as well, though the whispers were harder to understand. They spoke of something terrible, something that had happened long before they ever stepped foot into this house. Her curiosity grew, but so did her fear. The whispers began to torment them. No longer just faint murmurs in the dead of night, they became screams. Horrible, gut-wrenching screams that seemed to come from deep within the walls. The house felt suffocating, its every corner vibrating with a sense of urgency, a hunger. The blood-curdling cries echoed through the halls, reverberating off the walls, demanding to be heard. They spoke of betrayal, of hidden truths, of promises broken long before the house was theirs. Then the house did something worse. One night, as Lena stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, she saw it. The walls, those once serene, welcoming walls, began to bleed. Thick, dark blood oozed from the cracks in the key. Plaster, dripping onto the floor with an unsettling sound, like the slow dripping of a faucet. The blood pooled beneath her feet, staining the wood, seeping into the very foundation of the house. Lena screamed, stumbling backward in shock. She tried to reach for the phone to call David, but the line was dead. The house had cut her off from the outside world. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping so quickly that her breath misted in the air before her. She could feel the pressure building, like something was about to break, something was coming. Then, from the walls, she heard it again. David's voice. "Lena, you have to leave. It's not the house. It's us. It's always been us." Lena's heart nearly stopped. She spun around, searching frantically for him. But there was no sign of David. It was as though his voice had come from within the walls themselves, from a place that had no right to exist. The blood continued to drip, pooling at her feet, as the air grew thick and suffocating. Desperately, she ran through the house, trying to find David. She called his name, but the house answered, echoing his voice back to her, twisting it into something unrecognizable. The blood seemed to follow her, creeping up the walls, spreading through the rooms like a living thing. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled through the darkened hallways, her mind racing, her thoughts swirling in panic. And then, finally, she found him. David was standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at her with wide, terrified eyes. But there was something wrong. He looked different, his face pale, his body trembling. And then he spoke, but the words were not his own. "You shouldn't have come here, Lena," the voice rasped. "We've been waiting for you, for both of you." Lena's blood ran cold. The voice was wrong, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the house itself. The walls were closing in, the blood rising faster now, as though the house was devouring them both. David took a step forward, but then, in an instant, the blood surged, swallowing him whole. The house trembled violently as the walls began to crack, splitting open to reveal darkness beyond. Lena screamed his name, but it was too late. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the voice from the walls, whispering one final time, "The house has claimed you." And then, nothing. The sleep experiment. Mark had battled insomnia for years. Endless, restless nights had left him desperate for a solution. So when he saw an ad seeking volunteers for a new sleep study, he leaped at the opportunity. The study promised to cure even the most persistent cases of insomnia, and the compensation wasn't bad either. The lab was a sterile, windowless facility buried deep within a research complex. The researchers, dressed in white coats, assured Mark that the process was simple. He would be monitored while his sleep cycles were gradually adjusted using a controlled environment, diet, and mild sedatives. The first night, he slept soundly for the first time in years. By the third night, the researchers began weaning him off the sedatives. His dreams were vivid, strange landscapes, echoing whispers, glimpses of figures just out of sight. When he awoke, the sensations lingered, crawling under his skin like unseen insects. By the fifth night, sleep had abandoned him again. Lying awake in his observation room, he stared at the ceiling, his mind foggy from exhaustion. He noticed movement in the shadows. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination, just a side effect of fatigue. But then the figures solidified. Shapes lingered in the dark corners of the room, shifting, watching. Their outlines were amorphous, their presence oppressive. Whenever he turned to face them directly, they melted into the gloom, only to reappear elsewhere. On the seventh night, he voiced his concerns to the researchers. Dr. Reynolds, the head scientist, listened patiently before offering a reassuring smile. Hallucinations are a common result of prolonged sleep deprivation. Your mind is simply trying to fill in the gaps. Try not to focus on them. Mark tried to believe her, but the figures didn't vanish. As exhaustion wore down his resistance, he began to hear them whispering. Faint, unintelligible murmurs drifted through the air, like voices pressed against the edge of reality. His body felt heavier each night, his limbs sluggish, as if something unseen coiled around him, draining his energy. On the 10th night, he found the notebook. It had been left carelessly on a desk outside the observation room. Flipping through the pages, his blood ran cold. The notes detailed his reactions, his declining mental state, his descriptions of the figures in the shadows. And at the bottom of one page, scrawled in tight, precise handwriting, was a single chilling sentence. Subject is reacting to the entities as predicted. Entities, not hallucinations. Mark's breath hitched. His pulse pounded in his ears as he flipped through more pages, his horror deepening. The study hadn't been about curing insomnia. It had been about drawing something out, something that lurked in the space between wakefulness and sleep. Something that had noticed him now. He slammed the notebook shut and looked up. The shadows in the corner were no longer receding. They advanced, stretching, writhing, taking form. The air grew thick, oppressive, filled with whispers that now carried meaning. Stay with us. Join us. His legs refused to move. His body felt like it was sinking into the floor, being pulled downward by unseen hands. He screamed for help, but his voice barely escaped his lips. The observation room door swung open, and Dr. Reynolds stepped inside, her face unreadable. "It's already too late, Mark," she said softly. He barely registered the researchers surrounding him, murmuring notes as the shadows engulfed his vision. The last thing he saw before slipping into darkness was a reflection in the observation glass, his own form dissolving, fading into the writhing mass of shadows that had once only watched. The sleep experiment was a success, for them.